All right, so let's get going on today's class. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to start laying the groundwork, start laying the foundation of concepts that you need to know in order to do statistics at all. So today we're going to start introducing some of those basic foundational ideas that will allow you to build upon those ideas and do the amazing things that statistics will allow you to do. So before we get to that, though, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about one way to think about what we're going to be doing here in statistics. So typically, you can think of statistics as broken into two separate areas. One of those areas is descriptive statistics. And these are all the tools that you are going to learn so that you can take a whole bunch of numbers, a whole bunch of scores, a whole bunch of data, and you can make sense of thousands of these items of information. So you've all probably done some descriptive statistics before. If you've ever taken the average of numbers, you have done descriptive statistics, take a whole bunch of numbers and describe them with just one number using statistical techniques. Descriptive statistics is usually pretty straightforward. Students usually don't have any issues being able to grasp descriptive statistics. However, there's the other side of statistics, and this is inferential statistics. And this is where you can make inferences about a population from just taking a look at a small little sample. And it sounds very simple, but it is highly unintuitive a lot of times. And typically when I teach this course, if there's any place where students hit a roadblock in terms of just not being able to understand the concepts readily and intuitively, and it's not as straightforward as they expected, it's typically when we get to inferential statistics. So I wanted to try to get ahead of that situation and give you a general way of thinking about statistics, hopefully something that makes a little bit more intuitive sense, so that when we get to inferential statistics, your reaction will be, oh yeah, I remember this. This is like what we talked about before, and not, oh my goodness, what is this new thing? Where did this come from? So the way that I want you to think about inferential statistics, and basically just a nice way to apply a metaphor to what statistics allows you to do, is the idea of, there we go, the idea of the multiverse. So thankfully, the multiverse is a concept now that has infiltrated pop culture. Thankfully, now that I say multiverse, most people will understand, oh yeah, you mean like all the possible worlds that could exist depending upon decisions that people made. It's hard to believe right now, but pre the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this was not a topic that a lot of people immediately knew about, because the media that tackled it, things like Sliders and things like The One, produced about the same blank stares that I'm getting from everybody right now. So it is nice to know that it is now a concept that is out there. But we're going to see that you can think of inferential statistics as your view into the multiverse. Literally your ability to take a look into each of these worlds and see what happened in that particular world. So in this way, you're a little bit like the Marvel character Uatu. He's the Watcher. He's the one that is able to watch all of these different worlds. So with statistics, you're going to be able to take a look into all of these different worlds and take a look at a world where cars have 6 wheels instead of 4. You're going to be able to take a look at a world where the internal combustion engine was not invented first. The electric engine was invented first. And what is that world like? You'll be able to take a look into a world where you decided not to come to class today, but you stayed at home in bed to watch some Netflix. And you're going to be able to take a look into a world where Alan Turing was supported by the British government, and we had general AI decades before we do now. And if you want to know more about that, check my cognitive psychology videos for my little TED talk on that. But the idea is that it lets us look into a vast number of different worlds, a vast number of different possibilities, and then allow us to say, well, if those are the possibilities, what's going on in our world? What is going on in the situation that I'm facing right now? And as we're going to see, that's that's my suggested way to kind of think about what we're doing here in psychology. So we're going to get to that in just a little bit. First, let's talk about what we'll be covering today. So statistics as a view of the multiverse. We're going to start off with a few really simple examples of this, such as the idea of coin flips, and then take a look at a slightly more complex example with the male and female airline pilots demo. And then we are going to take a look at a controversial psychological study, Rosenhan, on being sane in insane places, where pseudo patients, where subjects in this study went to different mental health hospitals and pretended to have mental health issues to get admitted to see how soon they would be found out in terms of not being actual real patients. So we're going to take a look at that study and use it to illustrate the main terms that we're going to be focusing on today, which are individuals and variables and the different kinds of variables. We're going to talk about samples and populations, two very important concepts. And then we'll talk about observational studies and experiments. And those will be our focus on what we're doing today. All right, but before we do that, back to the multiverse. And what we're going to take a look at right now is a really simple idea in terms of this idea of these different worlds where things could happen. And that simple idea is something that everybody here is familiar with, everybody's done before, and that is the idea of coin flips. So let's start setting up this example here. So let's say that someone comes up to you and they say, hey, I want to play a game. And I have this coin here, and it's a fair coin. And we're just going to flip this coin. And it's a very simple game. If it flips up heads, I win. But if it flips up tails, then you win. And you say to yourself, all right, I'm game, let's do this. And you do the first flip, it comes up heads, and you lose. You then start asking yourself a question in your mind. You start thinking about it, and the question that you want to answer is, wait a second, is this a fair coin? Is the coin that this person is using actually going to end up heads half the time and tails half the time? Is it a fair coin? So you now have one flip and you lost. It ended up heads. So how many people, show of hands, how many people would at that time say, hey, wait a second, that's not a fair coin? All right, so nobody. So nobody at that point would accuse this person of not using a fair coin. So the game continues, and you flip it again. And the second flip comes up heads. So now you've lost 2 times in a row. At this point, would anybody be willing to say, hey, wait a second, that's not a fair coin? All right, still nobody. We go on to a third flip. It also comes up heads. How many people at this point would say, hey, that's not a fair coin? All right, start to see a lot of people thinking about it. We have one person that would call them out. You continue to play the game. Fourth flip, heads again. How many people now would say, wait a second, this is not a fair coin? Okay, we're about halfway in this particular sample. Let's say that you play it one more time. You got a fifth flip, heads. How many people now are going to say, hey, that's not a fair coin? All right, that's most. Let's say we do it one more time. We go to a sixth flip. Sixth flip comes up heads. How many people now are going to say, wait a second, you're cheating, that's not a fair coin? Okay, so most people would do it at that point, or everybody here has tired hands because they put their hands up earlier. But you can see that you are more willing to say and accuse this person that this is not a fair coin the more times that heads comes up, the more times that you lose in this particular game. And what you're doing in your mind intuitively is you're actually applying inferential statistics to this situation. You're actually doing what a statistician does. You're doing it intuitively. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that out of your intuitive mind and we're going to make it rigorous in the outside world so we know exactly what we're doing. But what is it that you're doing? Well, you're basically doing what Uatu does when he takes a look at the multiverse. And he says to himself, in every world where this coin flip game is occurring, what are the outcomes in all of these worlds? So we can kind of show that in a graphic here. So we have our fair coin universe, and this is where you start. When that person approaches you and say, hey, do you want to play a game? This is the world you're living in right now. He says, hey, do you want to play a game? You say, yes, let's do it. And on that first flip of the coin, you could either end up in the world where it came up heads, or you could end up in the world where it came up tails. So that one decision splits the universe into two possibilities. One is heads and the other one is tails. Now let's take a look at the heads pathway. So you're on that heads earth where heads came up the first time and you flip it again. And now again, the multiverse splits into two and you have the one world where it ended up heads and you have the other world where it ended up tails. And you can keep doing this for every single flip. I could only fit 3 flips in this graphic here, but you can do it for every single flip. And every single time that flip occurs, your mind is intuitively thinking about all the other possible worlds, about all the other possible outcomes. And what your mind is saying to you, maybe unconsciously, you might not be aware of this, but what it's basically saying to you is that, hey, I'm on this path right here. I just happened to go down this multiverse path here, and I ended up on the world where 3 heads in a row came up. Now, there are other worlds out there that are not like my world. Those are the green worlds. There's a world where tails came up 3 times. There's a world where it went tails, heads, tails. There's all these different worlds that led to all these different outcomes. And what your mind is saying is, what are the odds that I would end up here on the world where I lost 3 times in a row compared to ending up here? And you might not do the exact math, but I could kind of see in the emotional reactions, you kind of had that gut feeling. This chance that heads would occur randomly 3 times in a row is 12.5%. And what you need to make a decision about is that unlikely enough for me to say, hey, we don't belong in this fair coin universe? You're actually cheating me. There's a 12.5% chance that heads would come up 3 times. There's a 87.5% chance that it would not come up 3 times in a row. So is that enough for me to say, hey, you are cheating, you don't have that fair coin? So that is what you are intuitively doing. And that is literally what inferential statistics will allow you to do. It'll allow you to take a sample of how many heads in a row did we get and compare it to the population of all the possible outcomes in all the possible worlds. So basically what you're kind of doing intuitively is you're saying, all right, on that first flip, it came up heads. There's a 50% chance that this person won fairly, which means that there's a 50% chance that they're cheating. So the chances that it's a fair coin at that point in your mind is 50%. Most of you, actually, none of you were willing to call the person a cheater at that point, because 50% that they're telling the truth, that 50% chance that they're telling the truth was just too high for you to make that accusation. If 2 heads come up, there's now a 25% chance that they're telling you the truth, that this is a fair coin. And again, most of you were not willing to call this person a cheater after only 2 flips, because there's a 25% chance that they're actually telling the truth, that it's a fair coin. On the third flip, it got to 12.5%. And at this point, people started to feel a little bit uneasy. Note that you still don't know for sure whether or not the coin is fair. But after these 3 flips, you know that there's only a 12.5% chance that this coin is actually fair. So it starts weighing on you. Might this coin be unfair? And then around the 4th flip, this is when the first large group of you said, no, that's too many in a row. At this point, I would call them out. And that's when the chances of getting 4 heads in a row on a fair coin is only 6%. On the 5th flip, it goes down to 3%. And on the 6th flip, it's about 1.5%. And by then, everybody was like, okay, 6 flips in a row. I just can't believe that. I don't believe that it's a fair coin. I can't prove it because there's still that 1.5% chance that this person just got really, really lucky. But I am not willing to entertain anymore or give this person the benefit of the doubt anymore and say that this is a fair coin. I'm going to make that accusation. I'm going to say it's unfair. And again, that is what inferential statistics does. So basically, you are making that computation in your brain, in your mind. You're doing it intuitively. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to take that out of your intuition. We're going to put it down in front of you in a rigorous way that you can follow time and time again so that you don't have to rely on intuition and mental calculations, but you can actually find an objective, rigorous, step-by-step method for making these types of decisions. Now, the last thing that I'll mention, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about p-values, is that in statistics, you can never be certain. You can never prove things completely. You can only show that something is very, very unlikely. And then you ask yourself, am I willing to entertain a situation that is that unlikely? Or do I need to make the decision that something is going on here that's weird? So in this case, after flipping a coin, you ask yourself, you make that calculation, am I willing to accept that this person is using a fair coin and I'm just in this really, really unlikely red path in the multiverse? Or am I going to accuse them and say, hey, you know what? That's not a fair coin. And possibly make a mistake, possibly be in that red earth. You're on the red path, they're using a fair coin, and you come up and say, hey, you know what? I think you're cheating. And as we're going to see, that's what your p-value that you probably heard of in psychology before, that's what that p-value is all about. And we're also going to see that that p-value can change depending upon how bad is it if you make that mistake. How bad is it if you call out this person for cheating and they're not actually cheating? So you can imagine different scenarios where that accusation would have different repercussions and different consequences. So if you were playing a stranger on the street, if a stranger came up to you and said, hey, you know what, let's play this game. We'll flip this coin and it comes up heads, it comes up heads, it comes up heads, it comes up heads again. After maybe 4 flips, you're like, you know what, you're wasting my time. That's an unfair coin. I'll see you later and I will never see you again. So that is very low stakes. That is very low repercussions. You're probably not going to need a lot of evidence to call this person a cheater. On the other hand, let's say that it's your friend and your friend comes up to you and you know them to be an honest person and they haven't cheated you in the past and now they're playing this game with you. How many flips is it going to take them? It's probably going to take them a few more flips before you accuse them than it would that complete stranger. Because now the consequences of making that error, remember, you can never be completely sure, the consequences of making that error would carry a little bit more weight. And let's just say that you are working at a new job and this game was proposed by your boss. And you know that your boss is a harsh, stern person and they start flipping that coin and it starts coming up heads. You might think to yourself, if I accuse them and I'm wrong and they're actually telling me the truth, I might as well start looking for another job. So in this case, depending upon your current financial situation, you might get to 10, 11, 12 flips. before you're willing to say, hey, wait a second. I might need this job to put money on the table, but I think this coin isn't fair. So we're also going to see that where p-values can kind of shift depending upon the situation. But just for now, it's important to kind of have that in the back of your mind that what we're doing in statistics is we're comparing our outcome, the thing that happened on our Earth in a particular study, in a particular data collection. We are comparing it to what would have happened everywhere else in all the other possible Earths. And what we can do with statistics is we can say, hey, in our world, this happened. How many other worlds did it happen in as well? And does that make our result too unlikely to have been caused by chance? Or are we actually working with something here? Does it make it too unlikely that we have a fair coin, and we're actually dealing with an unfair coin in our world? All right, so that was example number one. Now let's take up the complexity just a little bit, and we're going to do a demo on male and female airline pilots. All right, so this is the situation. So an airline has just finished training 25 pilots, 15 male pilots and 10 female pilots to become captains. Unfortunately, only 8 captain positions are available. Airline managers announced that they will use a lottery to determine which pilots will fill the available positions. They write the names of all 25 pilots on identical slips of paper. They place the slips in a hat, mix them thoroughly, and draw them out one at a time until 8 positions are filled. A day later, managers announced the results of the lottery. Of the 8 captains chosen, 5 of them are female and 3 of them are male. Some of the male pilots who weren't selected suspect that the lottery was not carried out fairly, and they wonder if there may be grounds to file a grievance with the pilots' union. So we're going to take a look whether it is plausible or believable that in a situation like this, where there are 15 male captains and only 10 female captains, is it believable that 5 female captains could have been selected by chance alone? So was this a fair lottery where everybody was chosen fairly? Or is there some sort of shenanigans going on? Is something suspicious going on? So the way that we can do this is basically by taking a look at that multiverse and seeing what happened in the other world where this particular selection was done. So to do that, we are going to go to the Staplet application. So this is something, I'll post a link to this so that you can access it as well. But this is the activity that we just described. So what you can do here, and what is really cool, is that we know that there were 5 females selected and 3 males selected. But that's our world. So is that result really weird? And if it is weird, how weird is it? Well, one way that you can determine this is you can say, let's take a look at another world where this lottery was done. And we have our 15 males here, we have our 10 females here, and we're going to generate a sample. And we have this sample here in this other world. And in this other world, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 males were selected, and 1, 2, 3 females were selected. So that happened in the first alternative universe, right? In that first alternative Earth. And we can see that they actually had fewer females selected. It was only 3, it wasn't 5. So we can then say, well, that's just one other world. Let's take a look at another one. And we generate another sample. And in this new sample, we have this male chosen, this male chosen, this male chosen, this male chosen, this one, 5 males chosen again. And we again only have 3 females chosen. And we can continue doing this and looking at another possible world. And we're going to click this until we get one that isn't 3. There we go. All right. So we checked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 worlds. And in the 6th world, we saw that only 2 females were selected. And 4, what are we doing here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 8 pilots, right? 6 males, I can do math. 6 males were selected. And if you continue doing this, you start to see that there are worlds where this lottery was done fairly and a large number of females were still chosen. So here we encounter a world where not just 5 females were chosen the way they were in our world, but in this world, 6 females were chosen. Only 2 males and then 6 females by chance, fairly, were chosen. And we can continue to generate samples, and it populates this distribution here. So here we have the number of females selected. Probably should have mentioned that before. So these are the worlds where 0 females were chosen. These are the worlds where 1 female was chosen, 2 females, 3 females, all the way up to 8 females being chosen. And each time I generate a sample, it takes a look at another world and puts it into this histogram here. So it puts it into this histogram. So the height of the bar here, the height of the dots tells you how many worlds that we looked at were there 3, and how many worlds that we looked at were there 2. So we have 1 world where there was 4 females, 1 world with 5 female, and 1 world with 6 females. And we can just keep generating and generating and generating, and because we don't want to do this forever, we can quickly add 100 possible worlds, and we can hit go. And this is 100 worlds that we took a look at. And in those 100 worlds, you can see the vast majority of time, there was 3 female pilots chosen. Very rarely were there 5 female pilots chosen. But how rarely is that? And to do that, we can go down here and say, hey, you know what? Count the number and percent of dots that are greater than or equal to 5. So we had 5 females chosen in our world. And some of the male pilots thought that was weird. They thought that was suspicious. So what are the odds that if we did this fairly, we would end up with 5 female pilots or more? We would end up with a result that is as suspicious or even more suspicious than the one that we found. We can hit count, and we can see that there are 11 dots in the selected region. So out of all the worlds that we looked at, 9.3% of them had at least 5 females or more chosen. So then the question you need to ask yourself as a statistician is, now what do you do with that information? Do you say, well, that is unlikely enough that I am now going to the pilots union? Or are you going to say, well, you know what, that's like 10%, right? That's like a 1 in 10 chance. And I'm not going to call people out on a 1 in 10 chance. I'm willing to believe that. I'm willing to entertain the idea that even though it's unlikely, it's not beyond the realm of believability. And actually, if let's add some more here. Let's pump it up. 500. Now we have 11 and a half in the selected region. So it looks like about 10% of the time, you're going to get 5 females chosen, even though there's only 10 females and 15 males. So in this case, again, we have been able to look into all these different universes, all these different worlds. There's actually a world where no females were chosen. We take a look at all these different worlds. There's one world where 7 of them were chosen. All these different worlds, and it lets us know how unlikely was this result. And then that allows us to make the decision, do we say that this is actually suspicious? Right? Do we take that 9% chance that we could be wrong? We're going to go to the pilots union and they're going to do an investigation and they're going to find out that it's fair, and then it's going to come back on us and we're just going to be perceived as being unhelpful or unwilling. Do we take that chance? Because now it's down to 9%. And that, again, is the decision that you make based on the situation that you find yourself in. But importantly, statistics is what allows you to get that number. To get that 9.1% is the likelihood that this is actually a fair lottery. All right, any questions on that? Kind of making sense? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do now for the rest of today's class is we're going to take a look at a very famous, controversial study in psychology, and this is Rosenhan from 1973 on being sane in insane places. And the reason we're taking a look at this study is it is a nice way to illustrate what I like to call the words that do the work. So we are now going to go over some of the terms that we're going to be using here in this course a lot. These are the basic concepts that we're going to use in statistics. And some of these terms you will recognize, and that's actually probably not a good thing because some of these words don't mean what they mean in the English language. They have statistical definitions. So your knowledge of these words in common English usage might actually impede your ability to apply them properly in statistics. So I will point out some of those when they come up. But just know that when we're in this room and you're talking statistics, the terms have very specific meanings, and you need to be aware of those and fight your natural impulse to think of your regular English definition of these. But we'll see that in just a moment. All right, so on being sane in insane places. Did anybody cover this in their intro psych class? All right, cool, it'll be new. All right, so this was a very famous study, very controversial study, again, from 1973. And what they did in this study is they set out to test whether clinicians could reliably detect sanity in a psychiatric hospital setting. So they wanted to know in that particular environment with the clinicians that work there, if you walked through that door, would they be able to say, you know what, there's nothing wrong with you, you're sane, thank you very much, and have a good day. So what they did to test this is they took 8 healthy adults, and these adults are called pseudo patients, and these pseudo patients sought admission. They went to get admitted to 12 different psychiatric hospitals. And they would approach these hospitals and they would approach the admissions and they would report vague auditory symptoms, things that they heard, unclear voices that seemed to say things like empty, hollow, and thud. And other than false names that they used and false occupations that they gave, all of their histories were truthful. They didn't lie about anything else other than their names, other than their occupations, and other than they were hearing voices, and those voices tended to say things like empty, hollow, and thud. So once they were admitted, so they all were admitted, and once they were admitted, they immediately stopped simulating the behaviors. So once they were admitted, they just started behaving normally. So they wouldn't report hearing voices anymore, no empty, no hollow, no thud. Literally, as soon as the person said, okay, we're going to admit you to this hospital, they were like, okay, great. And they just acted normally. So they were cooperative, they were friendly. They would actually take notes openly in the ward about ward life. So they would sit there because they were all, I believe they weren't all scientists, but they knew they were doing an observational study. So they sat there recording their observations into their journals. And even though literally from the time they were admitted, they immediately turned off any symptoms, they were still treated as patients. And they responded to routine instructions. When it was time to go to the rec room, they would go to the rec room. When it was time for lunch, they would go to eat lunch. They responded to calls for medication. So they were prescribed medication, and they responded to calls for medication, but they did not actually take the meds. They discreetly did not swallow the medications. And very surprisingly, and this is where the notoriety of this research comes out, none of them were detected as sane by any of the staff. So none of the staff during their stays at these hospitals called them into their office and said, hey, you know what? We've been monitoring your behavior. We had some interviews with you. You filled out some diagnostic tests. There's nothing wrong with you. You know, you've been wasting our time. You came here under false pretenses, or at the very least, don't infer any causation. There's just nothing wrong with you. You know, maybe it was like a temporary hallucination, whatever it is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. None of these 8 individuals was detected as sane by any of the staff. So they were later, so when they were admitted, they were all diagnosed with schizophrenia, except for one patient. They don't say pseudo patient. They don't let us know what they were diagnosed with. And later, when they were discharged, they weren't discharged as cured. They weren't discharged as never having schizophrenia. They were discharged as schizophrenia in remission. And so that schizophrenia label stuck, even though they never showed symptoms of schizophrenia while they were in the psychiatric hospital. Still, they were diagnosed with schizophrenia, but now it's in remission. So the hospitalization ranged from 7 days to 52 days. So one pseudo patient actually stayed in the psychiatric hospital for 7 weeks. That's almost 2 months long, acting normal in a psychiatric hospital, and they weren't let out. Average is about 19 days, so about 3 weeks. And this study is often used to highlight just how a certain context, like a psychiatric hospital, and labeling somebody as having schizophrenia, for example, can just shape the interpretation of all their behaviors later. So all of those normal behaviors, because they were happening, at least that's what the study concludes, because they were happening in a psychiatric hospital, and because they were happening they're being done by people who were diagnosed as schizophrenic, they were interpreted as still supporting that diagnosis, and they weren't seeing the behavior for what it was, which is totally normal behavior, and that's why these people weren't discharged until, on average, 19 days later. All right, so that's the study in general. Any questions before we start breaking it down in terms of statistical terms? All right, so let's go with the first term that we're going to take a look at today, and this is one where your understanding of the English word is actually going to hurt your ability to use it statistically. So this is a pre-warning. This is a heads up. Just remember this one, very, very tricky because it is the word individual. And I know you all know what individual means in the English language, but an individual in statistics is a person, an animal, or a thing described in a set of data. So it's not just a person. It's not your normal use of the word individual. It's a person, it's an animal. I know many of us would call animals individuals, but it's also a thing, right? So that desk right there could be an individual. That projector could be an individual in statistics. So just remember those terms because this one is a little weird. Individual, person, animal, or thing described by a set of data. So on the one hand, in this study, we have the individual of pseudo patients, right? So the pseudo patients, they were 8 people, and they were described in a set of data. They were described, for example, in terms of how long they stayed in the hospital, somewhere between 7 and 52 days for each of them, average of 19. So in this study, the pseudo patients, each one of them would be an individual. However, in this study also, we have the hospital as individual. These hospitals were individuals. Each hospital was tested. The 12 sites were tested. So these hospitals, they got sets of data from them. What was the diagnosis from these hospitals when they were admitted? How long did each hospital keep the patients there for? So the hospitals are also individuals in statistical terms. So again, an individual is a person, animal, or thing described in a set of data. That hospital is a thing in this study that they collected data on and was described in that set of data. All right, so we got individual. Next one is variable. And a variable is any attribute that can take different values for different people, animal, or things, for different individuals, right? So any characteristic that can be different amongst different individuals. So before we take a look at examples of a variable from this study, we need to split variables up into two broad categories. The first one is a categorical variable. And a categorical variable, they take values that are labels. And then each individual, pseudopatient or hospital, for example, gets put into a particular group based on that label, and then that group is called a category. So one example of a categorical variable in this study were the diagnosis labels. So people were diagnosed as schizophrenia. That could have been different. One of them was not diagnosed with schizophrenia. I really wish the paper would say what they were diagnosed with. They weren't diagnosed with schizophrenia, but that's a variable. What were they diagnosed with? It could have been depression. It could have been anxiety. It could have been schizophrenia. It could have been obsessive compulsive disorder. Those are all things that could have taken different values and would have put them into different categories, hence the categorical variable. And also within the study, you have schizophrenia versus schizophrenia in remission. At the beginning of each of the study, the pseudo patients were placed into the category of schizophrenia. At the end of the study, they were moved into the category of schizophrenia in remission. Those are categorical variables, different attributes that can take different values. Another example of categorical variables from this study was the occupations that these pseudo patients had. So these were their real occupations. So 3 of them were psychologists, 1 of them was a pediatrician, 1 was a psychiatrist, 1 was a painter, 1 was a housewife, and then 1 was unrecorded in terms of their occupation. So again, these are all labels that put people into different categories. So we have 3 individuals in the category of psychologist, we just have 1 individual in the category of painter. And then the last categorical variable that I'll mention from this study is the pseudo-patient sex. So we had 3 women and 5 men out of the 8 individuals that were the pseudo-patients in this particular study. All right, so that's the idea of a categorical variable where the values are labels, and those labels put individuals into categories. On the other hand, you can also have quantitative variables. And these are variables that take number values that are actual quantities, counts or measurements. And the important thing here is that these are number values that are quantities. So they have to be, they can't just be numbers, they have to stand for amounts of something. So for example, length of stay, that is a quantitative variable because the number that you get, the value that you get, indicates how many days you stayed in that psychiatric hospital. So one person got the number value, the quantitative variable value of 7, meaning that they spent 7 days. Another person got 52, meaning that they spent 52 days. And the reason I'm talking about this in kind of a weird way is that occasionally you will see numbers applied to categorical variables. And people will say, all right, we're putting this person into group 1, we're putting this person into group 2, we're putting this person into group 3. So always be careful when you see numbers, ask yourself, do they represent a quantity? Is group 2 twice as much of a group as group 1? Is group 3 times a group as group 1? And you can see with the words coming out of my mouth, that makes no sense. It doesn't make sense to treat them as quantitative, they're categorical. So when you're dealing with numbers, always ask yourself, does this number actually represent an amount, a quantity? If it does, then it's quantitative variable. All right, the next 2 here are going to be big. They are what inferential statistics is based on. So this is where you're going to get introduced. The term population. Population is the entire group of individuals, people, animals, or things that you want information about. And that is what is the real power of statistics, because you would like to say something about everybody, the population, but you never have access to everybody. You only have access to some of the people, and that is a sample. So in this study, for example, Rosenhan was not interested in just these 12 hospitals that were visited. It wasn't like he was doing an investigative report on these particular 12 hospitals and he only wanted to know about those 12 hospitals. On the contrary, he wanted to be able to say something about all the psychiatric hospitals in the US, about all the admissions in the US. So that is the goal. You want to say something about the population, and the population is all of the individuals. So if you are doing a study on single moms and you study 10 single moms, you are not just interested in those 10 single moms. You're hoping to say something about all single mothers, right? So we're always looking to say things about the population. So in this study, that population was all the psychiatric hospitals in the US. However, if Rosenhan studied all the psychiatric hospitals in the US, he would probably still be doing this study decades later, and some poor pseudo patient would still be stuck in a hospital, probably for way longer than 52 days. So in order to do the study, what do? Well, you say, I can't possibly visit all the hospitals. I can't study the population. What I'm going to study is a sample. I'm going to take a sample, a selection, a subset of individuals, people, animals, or things. I'm going to take a subset from the population, and I'm going to study those ones in particular. So this sample came from all of the US hospitals, and what they actually were the 12 hospitals that were chosen. So can't do all of them, want to say something about all of them, want to say something about the population, but I can't do it, so I can only choose 12, so that is my sample. And inferential statistics is about studying a sample and then making inferences about it, about the entire population. So you go from a sample to a population, and that's what inferential statistics is going to be all about. So that's one example of going from a population, all the US hospitals, but in the study, they only used a sample. The next example from this study is that he wanted to know about the entire group of individuals. Oh, sorry, let's start with the definition of population. Population is the entire group of individuals you want information about. So in terms of people admitted to psychiatric hospitals, Rosenhan wanted to know about all people admitted to psychiatric hospitals. He wanted to be able to say something about the population of people admitted to psychiatric hospitals, all of them. However, he couldn't possibly study all of the people admitted to psychiatric hospitals. So what do? You do a sample, and you say, all right, I'm going to choose a subset of patients that are, or individuals that are admitted to psychiatric hospitals, and I'm going to do that with 8 pseudo patients. So always keep in mind that in statistics, you're going to be working with samples, but we're always trying to say something about a population. So when we start off, we're going to start off with descriptive statistics, where we take a look at a sample and how do we understand what's going on with the sample. And then later, we're going to apply that multiverse idea, and we're going to take a look at how does our sample let us say things about what's going on with everybody that makes up the population, everybody that we could be interested in. All right, a few more terms, and we will be finished with the words that do the work. All right, the next one is observational study. So in an observational study, you observe individuals and you measure variables of interest, but you actually don't try to influence the responses. So you don't change anything, you don't influence anything, you don't do anything to influence the responses. You're not a cause looking to observe an effect. You're just sitting there like an observer, and you are taking a look at what happens. So there are aspects of this study that are observational, and specifically the pseudo patients observed the staff and patient behavior. So when the pseudo patients were in these hospitals, they would make little notes, and there was actually extensive note taking by these pseudo patients about what was going on, about what they observed. Now, they didn't do anything to try to influence those responses. Remember, they acted normally. They didn't change the way that they act. So they didn't throw a tantrum to see, well, how does the staff respond to a tantrum? They didn't pretend to forget their name to see, well, how does the staff react if I, forget my name? No. They just sat there and they just observed. And one of the really interesting findings is one way to put it. There's something about it. I guess ironic might be another way to put it, although I don't think anybody really knows what that means. But one of the ironic things is that none of the staff ever questioned whether the pseudo patients were sane. None of the staff ever questioned whether the pseudo patients were pretending. However, patients themselves voiced their suspicions. So this is a quote from the study. So patients, 35 out of a total of 118 patients, so basically a third of the patients on the admissions ward voiced their suspicion, some vigorously, you're not crazy, you're a journalist or a professor, referring to the continual note-taking, you're checking up on the hospital. So there was something about maybe personally experiencing mental health illnesses that gave them a better insight. There's something about, the phrase game recognized game comes up, and in this case, they had no insanity game to speak of, but it was the patients themselves that were actually successful at realizing that these individuals, these pseudo patients, were not the real deal, and they actually weren't suffering from any mental health issues. All right, so that's an observational study. You just go to a situation and observe. Just take a look and note your observations. On the other hand, you also have the experiment study. And an experimental study is where you deliberately impose a treatment, you impose a condition on individuals to measure their responses. So you change a situation, and then you sit back and you see what happens because of that situation that you changed. And this one is one where that understanding of the word individual needs to be very clear, because the treatment that was imposed on an individual was imposed on the hospitals, and the hospitals were the individuals. And the treatment that was imposed on them was the treatment of pseudo patient versus real patient. So Rosenhan and the pseudo patients basically imposed the treatment of coming in there and acting as if they were, they had these mental health issues, and then stopping those health issues. They were pseudo patients versus the real patients that were being admitted naturally. So that was the treatment in this case. It wasn't that Rosenhan went to the hospitals and said, you know what, I would just like to see and observe how the patients are treated, right? How the real patients that were admitted are treated. That would have been an observational study. But what they did instead is they said, okay, we're going to do this treatment. We're going to send in 8 pseudo patients. They're going to pretend to have mental difficulties to get admitted, but then they're going to stop, and then we're going to see what happened. So that treatment on the individual, which was the hospital, was that pseudo patient versus the real patient. And then one more term for experiments is the idea of a control group. And a control group is a very important concept. And this is the group that is used to provide that baseline for comparing the effects of the treatment. So you might have a group that is treated, but how do you know if the treatment makes a difference? Well, you compare it to a group that was untreated. And in this study, it's never explicitly stated, but it is heavily implied, which is just poor writing in my opinion. But in this case, the real patients were the control group, and that was implied. So they were comparing how were their patients treated to the actual real patients that were admitted. How long was it before their patients were discharged compared to the actual real patients that were in that psychiatric hospital? What were the final diagnoses of their pseudo patients compared to the actual real patients and their final diagnoses? So in this case, the treatment of the pseudo patients was compared to the control group, and those were the actual real patients. All right, any questions on any of the terms, any of the ideas that we covered so far in the Rosenhan on being sane and insane places? It's good? All right, in that case, I got a couple of questions. So one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, and this is just something that I want to bring up in general because you're pursuing psychology, and I just want to make sure that we all have an appreciation of what we're trying to accomplish here, and that hopefully when you talk to people outside of psychology, you can communicate that impression of what we are trying to accomplish here. So this study has often been held up as an indictment of psychiatric hospitals. This study has often been held up at how poorly the admissions staff was able to make the correct admissions. It's often held up, as I mentioned before, of how the environment of the psychiatric hospital influences all of the behaviors and things that they observed, right? So normal behaviors were not seen as being normal. They were seen as still being indicative of schizophrenia, which is why they remained in the psychiatric hospital. Basically, this study is often held up as a failure of psychology. And that's one particular way to look at it. However, there's another way, and that's one of the ways that I kind of take a look at it. And I'll get you there, or I'll explain this viewpoint with a couple of questions. So the first one that I want you to think about is, let's say that this experiment was done again, but instead of going to a psychiatric hospital, these individuals went to a general hospital, a medical hospital. And instead of complaining about hearing voices in their head, they complained about another vague symptom. They complained about stomach pain. What do you think would happen to these pseudo patients at a general medical hospital if they went in to the hospital and they said, you know what, oh my gosh, I have stomach pain, it hurts really bad, and they're like, okay, we're going to get you admitted, we're going to take you to this room, and as soon as you get admitted, you're like, all right, thank you very much. And they come to you and they say, how's your stomach? And you're like, fine. Did you have anything weird to eat today? No. What do you think would happen if that occurred in the general medical hospital? Yep. They would send you home. And do you think it would take 9 days? No. You think it would take 90 minutes? Maybe. Yeah, probably. It would not take the average of 19 days for them to say, hey, you know what? There's nothing wrong with you. Probably just a false alarm. Probably just some fast food that you ate, right? They would try to come up with an explanation. But once you turned off the symptoms, it would not take long at all for those medical professionals to say, you know what, you're good to go home. So that leads into question number 2. What does that imply about the human mind? So psychology has been around as a formal science approximately 200 years by now. So not as long as medicine, which predates, you can go back to what is it? Was his Hippocrates? No, what is his name? The Hippocratic Oath guy from Greek history. You can go back millennia for medical. But we've had 2 centuries of studying the human mind. Does the fact that it took, on average, 19 days for these psychiatric admissions people to discharge these pseudo patients who had nothing wrong with them, does that indicate, for example, that we are dealing with the human mind something that's simpler than the physical body, or is it something that's more complex than the physical body? It's yeah, more complex. So the human mind is vastly more complex than, I would say, anything that science tries to study. I think the human mind is more complicated than the universe itself, with the understanding that the universe contains all the human minds. And if you can wrap your head around that, you'll start to understand just how weird and wonderful and just complicated the human mind is. So, that being said, I take this study less as an indictment of the poor quality of psychiatric admissions, definitely can be improved. And I take it more as an indication of just how complicated the human mind is to try to understand, and just how still groping in the dark we're doing in terms of trying to understand what is going on in the human mind. And in terms of, for example, diagnoses of schizophrenia, there have been theories that one of the reasons that schizophrenia is so hard to treat is because the people that we put into the category of schizophrenia, remember those categorical labels? We put them in the category of schizophrenia. Those people are not the same. Those people might have 20 different things that we can't distinguish between, and we just call them all schizophrenia. And that's why some treatments are highly successful for some people, but they're not for other people. And it would be as hard to treat those people successfully as if we were dealing with physical illnesses and somebody said, I broke my arm, and we didn't know what an arm or a leg or a nose or a foot was. How could we possibly treat these people effectively unless we got those variables down? So it's just kind of an indication. I just want you to know what noble pursuit you're getting yourself into. The human mind is vastly, vastly more complicated than anybody, I think, really has ever grasped. I don't think your mind is made to grasp just how complicated your own mind is. So when I see a study like this on being sane in insane places, it's less an indictment of psychiatry and psychology as not being up to the task, and it's just more a realization and a reminder that this mind that we're dealing with is massively complicated. We're still at the beginning of it, 200 years in, and we still don't know enough, at least back in 1973, to be able to make one of the most critical, categorical, variable categorizations we're trying to do, sane versus insane. So it just goes to kind of remind us that we do have a very daunting task, and to try to understand the mind. And the more that we can get tools and techniques to help us, like statistics, the more we'll be able to crack that riddle, crack that mystery, and understand more about this massively complicated set of things that are going on that cause our behavior, that cause our thoughts. All right, so that is all that I wanted to cover for today. So today, we introduced the idea of the multiverse. We introduced that idea of statistics being able to allow you to take a look at all these different worlds and compare your world to all those other worlds. We illustrated that with the idea of coin flips. How many coin flips before you say, hey, you know what, that's not a fair coin? We took a look at male and female airline pilots and just how unlikely was it that 3 male pilots and 5 female pilots were chosen. As it turns out, 10% chance that would occur. And then with that information, you can go further and decide what you want to do. And then we ended it with that look at Rosenhan on being sane in insane places, illustrating a lot of the terms that we're going to be using. Review those terms. The part where I pointed out individual does not count, does not mean what it meant in English, is one of the reasons why I make the vocab coach do every single week, because getting that vocab down will allow you to really grasp what psychology, what statistics really is about. So when we talk in the future about individuals, the more you have it in your mind that an individual is a person, animal, or thing, and that is automatic, the more sense what I say about stuff is going to make. So do yourself a favor, do those vocab coaches, get set on the terminology, because the more you have to think about the terminology as we go forward in this course, the less you're going to be able to pay attention to what we're talking about using the terminology, and it just puts you a couple of steps back and makes it that much difficult to do. All right, but unless there's any other questions, all right, that is it for today. So thanks for joining me. And what we're going to do next time is we are going to start up on the only new math that you're going to learn, which is the summation notation. So if you haven't already, be sure to do the summation notation and order of operations video activities. But other than that, we are done for the day.